Aggressively defensive. That's how I would describe the combat in Lies of P, at least when it comes to elite enemies and bosses. Niaois has created an almost perfect gameplay loop, mixing standard Souls-like level design and mob fighting, carving through enemies, and taking the role as the aggressor as you push towards the next objective or piece of loot, and then flips that on its head when it comes to the elite fights and the boss fights. If you try to man down the majority of these encounters, you will most likely be met with a game over screen, and while the game does condition you that basic enemies are at your mercy, the exact opposite is true when it comes to bosses. This is the rigid reality of Lies of P, one that no build or play style can really change, and one that you will need to accept to see that there is a masterpiece within this title. It is this aspect that almost lost me as a player when I first played the demo, and this aspect that I'm sure has prevented plenty of people from enjoying or even attempting to understand the game. And while I find it to be a shame that this aspect has walled off so many players from the Lies of P experience, I believe now it's created this game for a much more targeted audience, just as the games that inspired it the most had done. Lies of P wears its inspirations on its sleeve, and the two biggest inspirations at play here are Bloodborne and Sekiro. I find it no coincidence at all that these three games, Sekiro, Bloodborne, and Lies of P, all took the Dark Souls formula and stripped it down to its bare elements, and refined what was left to something truly special. Bloodborne, for instance, stripped the majority of the defensive options and playstyles away from the players that they're accustomed to in Dark Souls. Players that had become accustomed to hiding behind great shields would find that shields are virtually non-existent, sans a wooden shield that is put in place just to taunt you, and a magic shield only useful in very specific situations for deflecting projectiles. Blocking outside of the two mediocre options the game gives you is not a mechanic, and most armor you choose are for fashion before they are chosen for whatever stats they increase. By doing so, they took the risk of alienating players that believe defense is the best offense, so that they could hone in on the art of aggression and build a new and unique gameplay loop around that aggression. The quick and responsive dashing allows players to stay close to their adversaries, while always having an available means to outmaneuver them better than what rolling in Dark Souls could have. Using a gun for parrying meant that you could use most enemies' aggressions against them from any distance, taking the risk out of this high reward mechanic, incentivizing its use. And finally, and most importantly, the rally mechanic meant that taking damage could always be countered by simply upping your own aggression, and by failing to do that, you would see that potential health slowly melting away. All of these systems work together perfectly to give Bloodborne its unique identity, solidifying it as a masterpiece of its time. It's important to bring up rallying here because it is an important and central mechanic to Lies of P as well, although it's being used in a much different way, right beside the central mechanic of Sekiro, perfect blocking or parrying. Sekiro, even more so than Bloodborne, stripped the Dark Souls mechanics to its rawest form. Different armor, different weapons, builds, and even leveling were thrown entirely out the window to create a streamlined experience centered around parrying, prosthetic weapons, and the posture system, creating something so far removed from the Souls formula that many don't consider it a Souls-style game at all, only lumping it with the others due to From Software development and the punishing difficulty. It seems that the more From Software moved away from Dark Souls, the more potential they had to alienate their core audience. But by cutting away those strings, it allowed Sekiro to create a refined Game of the Year winning experience that has yet to be matched, serving as the primary inspiration moving the puppet strings behind Lies of P, both through mechanics and that refinement of the genre. This has turned Lies of P from more than just a Souls clone into something unique. And let's talk about Souls clone, because Souls clone is a term that gets tossed around a lot when talking about Souls-likes. Games like Hellpoint or Bleak Faith Forsaken, for example, take difficult action RPG with death mechanics and at least one poison swamp, and hope to thrive off of that alone, knowing that the tag Souls-like will attract eyes and generate players, but ultimately failing when it comes to understanding why people love the Souls games so much, and more importantly, failing to add anything unique and meaningful to push the genre forward. Fortunately for Lies of P, they understood the assignment, for the most part. Imitation is the biggest form of flattery, and while yes, the rallying, parrying, and even the Legion arm systems are all tried and true From Software mechanics, these alone would not have been enough to carry Lies of P, or even catch people's attention. From the announcement trailers forward, the tone and the world that Lies of P was creating was eye-catching. Taking just enough of that dark action horror aesthetic from Bloodborne and wrapping it around the children's classic Pinocchio was what grabbed me originally, and the final product did not disappoint. Lies of P for me hit that sweet spot with its levels and its world design, creating areas that had enough intrigue to them to make me want to explore them, and enough payoff at the end of them when I did explore to leave me satisfied. In fact, the whole level traversal experience is just satisfying overall. One of my favorite tricks to make linear areas feel less so is having a central checkpoint that the map rotates around. And through progression, you open up more and more shortcuts back to that central point. This allows for you to have the best of both worlds, allowing an initial run through an area to have a specific experience, while gradually opening the level up for ease of backtracking and allowing the players to move through whatever route is most convenient for their experience and their goals. This expands more when you look at the world map overall, with most routes looping back to Hotel Krat, creating cohesion in the world geometry, making a world that feels real and purposeful, instead of just a bunch of levels strung together haphazardly. And while the levels themselves do start to lose some of that care and detail near the end of the game, specifically the tower, overall the playground that is created is just a joy to fight through. And this loops us back to the combat experience of Lies of P, which I feel may be the most difficult Souls-like game to date, at least on your first playthrough. This is largely due to the game wanting and almost requiring a very specific playstyle to be successful, similar to what Sekiro and Bloodborne did in the past, but in a more polarizing way. To put it bluntly, Lies of P has an extremely high skill floor. The dodge windows are akin to Dark Souls 2 before you pump any points into adaptability, and the distance you travel is highly reliant on your weight. The parry frames are half of what you have in Sekiro, and depending on your weapon of choice, blocking will leave you with mixed results thanks to how the rally system works. This is because your weapon choice determines how much health turns gray when blocking, and also determines how much gray health you get back when attacking back or parrying. And deeper than that, the speed of your weapons, specifically the charged R2s, will determine how safe it is to try and get hits in to get that health back. Taking direct damage removes all of that gray health as well, but also waiting too long between attacking or parrying, which seemed to be roughly about 3 to 5 seconds depending on upgrades, would start your gray health draining on its own. Naturally, faster weapons that hit less hard are going to regain less of that gray health on attack, and will force you to take more gray health damage when blocking. And likewise, bigger, heavier weapons won't punish you as much for blocking, and will regain more from hits, assuming that you are able to get hits in with these slower swinging speeds. Hyper armor is hard to come by, being locked primarily behind Fable attacks, so hit trading will almost always be enemy-sided. And it might sound like I'm being negative here, but this is just the harsh reality that you need to accept in order to get the most out of the Lies of P experience. And even after you've wrapped your head around how the game wants you to play, you're still gonna die a ton. That barrier to entry is both Lies of P's biggest flaw, and for me personally, its biggest draw. This is because the Lies of P systems all meld together in a way that may be overwhelming at first, but once they are understood, make the game truly satisfying and a truly unique experience. Attacking and parrying alone interact not only with the rally mechanic, but also with the Fable generation, the stagger system, the healing systems, and weapon breaking systems if the enemies are armed with a weapon. All of this combined with the weapon building systems, the grinder wheels, the throwables that while extremely limited are extremely useful, and the Legion arms, some of which are actually playstyle defining. And you have an extremely engaging and surprisingly deep combat system that, while it asks a lot of the player, is extremely rewarding to learn. While the majority of these mechanics may be lost on the standard mobs of the game, allowing for the level design to take center stage, bosses make full use of everything in your arsenal. Out of all the bosses in Lies of P, I was only able to beat 2 of them on my very first try. The first was the first boss of the game, and the second was a reskin of that same boss near the midpoint of the game. The rest of the boss encounters are designed to not be beaten on the first try, and require you to learn them. This is very much the Sekiro school of boss design. The high risk, high reward playstyle the game pushes you into requires learning that just cannot be reasonably figured out off of reaction alone. This is both a praise and my only true critique of Lies of P. Bosses ask a lot of the player. The variety and movesets are large, and every attack needs to be learned so that you can respond with the appropriate answer, whether that answer is a dodge, block, parry, or run away can only be determined by trial and error. This can be said about most games within the genre, but most games in the genre allow for a much larger safety net on your engagements. Lies of P boss fights are up-close affairs. Parrying, dodging, counterattacking all require you to consistently and constantly stay in the aggression range of these bosses. Combine this with the fact that both of your most reliable forms of damage mitigation in dodging and parrying both have larger windows of error than any other game in the genre, and that blocking not only forces you to grind your weapon back more often, but is effectively postponing the inevitable without you properly parrying or counterattacking in response. And the attention to detail required to best some of these bosses can get quite large quite fast. Speaking of large, boss health bars tend to get quite big as well, and if you're not constantly staggering enemies for those juicy viscerals, fights can drag on, slowly chipping you down till you're out of resources. All of this boils into what some would consider fun, engaging, and challenges worth overcoming, while others would see this as frustrating, unfun, and in some instances unfair. And I believe both camps are correct here, not because the bosses of the game are truly unfair. They're just unfair at first. You know how in Elden Ring, how Margit does that one attack with the ridiculously long windup and then the instant snap for the actual attack? It's an attack that is almost unable to be reacted to, so for myself and I'm sure others, we time out the passive frames of the animation to try and preemptively dodge when the attack comes. This may take multiple attempts to pin down on the timing, but through trial and error the attack can be consistently dodged. Lies of P bosses are exactly like that, only every one of them has multiple variants of these style of attacks, and at least one of these per boss has to be parried. This style of attack makes sense for the robotic puppet enemies, lending to the feeling of like a gear hitching up and then suddenly it breaking loose, unleashing the attack. It all feels very mechanical and on brand, while also increasing the difficulty of these encounters. Non-puppet enemies do have more flow to them, but still take advantage of these awkward timings, and considering that pinpoint parrying and dodging are your defensive options, you're gonna get hit, and probably die a lot. And this is just the start of what the game asks for you when it comes to its bosses. Every boss has at least one attack that is a fury attack. These attacks make the enemy glow red, and the only defense for them is parrying. If you dodge, you're gonna get hit. If you block, you get hit and lose all of your stamina. And if you try to run away, the majority of these attacks will gap close to you. These fury attacks also tend to be the hyper-delayed attacks we've talked about earlier, so trial and error is the only way to figure these attacks out. There is an amulet you get about halfway through the game that allows you to dodge through these attacks, but it takes up a valuable amulet slot and doesn't help you with the beginning of the game. So by the time that you get it, parrying will probably feel more comfortable anyway. And if you have perfected parrying like the game wants you to, grab attacks throw another layer of difficulty into the mix. These grab attacks have no obvious cue to them, no glowing like a grab attack in Sekiro does or like the fury attacks do here, and cannot be parried. This makes them the exact opposite of the fury attacks where dodging or distance is the only course of action for them. But without an obvious cue like the fury attacks have, it's easy for you to be in the rhythm of parrying and for these grabs to completely break your overall momentum. For me, these are the most frustrating attacks in the game, and the only design choice that I feel goes against the overall design of the game. But that being said, these attacks do have their own unique animations, and with enough time can be read and reacted to. You wrap all of this together, and the boss package that this game offers you may ask more from players than any other game in the genre, and ask more from players than they're willing to give back. Again, this might sound like I'm being overly negative, but I'm not saying this is a problem. For me, it's quite the opposite. This is an engaging and evolving experience, and the process of getting bodied to eventually mastering the boss is extremely satisfying. But I know that not everybody is going to share that opinion. I've seen and heard a few complaints of the combat, some valid, others feel like nitpicking. Staggers only trigger off of certain moves, mainly charged heavies, the upgraded puppet string, or select fable arts. Combined with these small windows that bosses allow you to retaliate is a common complaint that I've heard. I see no issue with this myself outside of some of the heavier weapons not having as easy of a time finding attack windows. This is not to say those windows aren't there, and recognizing them is part of the nuance to those slow heavy hitting styles. The lack of stagger bar visibility is another common complaint I've heard, one that I can totally agree with considering how important the stagger mechanic is to the game. While not knowing can be frustrating, I did find that once I got in tune with what weapon I was using, and in tune with the fight that I'm doing itself, that I could almost predict when a stagger was going to go off, and prep myself beforehand to take as much advantage as possible of that stagger window. And speaking of staggering, some endgame bosses have what I like to call a retribution attack, or attacks that happen after you land a stagger, but before you can execute the visceral. I've seen this complained about, stating that it goes against what the game has taught you up until that point, and while yes, the first time it happens to you, it can be frustrating, especially if the boss is hard to stagger in the first place and you had good momentum going. But after that, I guarantee it will never hit you again. These extended animations also come with an extended window for counterattacks, whether it's from a throwable, a legion arm, or getting behind them for some bonus damage. If that seems unsafe, it could also be a proper time to grind your weapon back up to full or heal yourself. And I've honestly found these moments, once I recognize that they are there, they're more of an opportunity than a downside for the player. And that's why I enjoy Lies of P so much. This game knows what it is, knows what it expects of the player, and if the player is willing to learn and play by the game's rules, there is so much nuance and fun to be had breaking down the moment-to-moment gameplay. It isn't perfect, and to some may feel like it is made specifically to piss you off. But for me, the challenge almost always felt 100% fair, and overcoming that feeling of fair yet challenging adversity is one of the best feelings you can get in this genre. To me, that's what sets Lies of P apart from other games in the space. They knew why people enjoy these games so much, and they respect the player enough to give them a challenge that they're looking for. They know it's not just about killing the player over and over, but giving that death a purpose, something to learn and improve upon until victory is achieved, and giving fun and unique tools to master during that process. I'm very much looking forward to the DLC that is planned to come out for this aggressively defensive masterpiece, along with whatever Niawitz makes in the future. Lies of P has earned my attention and my respect. And if you found this video enjoyable, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We'll be doing more videos like this into the future. I also have several Lies of P runs up on the channel, including a no leveling run for your enjoyment if you're so inclined. But until next time, Tenno Crew, take care, much love, and bye-bye.